The last part of the working phase 4, is termination. And termination is a very delicate process sometimes, and sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. It just depends on the context. But termination is a term that is used for any ending of the therapeutic relationship or the therapeutic episode. So for termination, we're going to talk about the timing of it, how to facilitate termination, so to make it easier, how do we document termination, the follow-up process, and referral and recycling processes. So termination is a part of therapy, kind of like the old trope that death is a part of living. So it is a part of therapy, and it is how you end the therapeutic relationship. Unlike most other relationships that are intended to last indefinitely, therapy is designed to end sometime. That sometime comes at the timing that we expect it. Sometimes it comes a little bit sooner than we expect it. Sometimes it lasts a lot longer than we expect it to. And sometimes termination happens on our terms. Sometimes it happens not on our terms. We'll talk about a couple examples of that. But it's just the ending of the therapeutic process. So when clients end therapy on everybody's terms or when they want to, um, we have what's called complete therapy. So that's when all the goals have been met, the stressful issues have been eliminated in the case of something like a PTSD, to where even though they had been upset by a certain thing, whatever that thing was has been eliminated, so there's no more need for therapy. And you've also dealt with the emotions that lingered on with it, or enough progress has been made to end the episode. So if somebody comes in to see us because they're feeling really depressed, and even though they're not feeling completely well, they are feeling good enough to the point that they can stop therapy and continue the work on their own. Generally, adequate progress can be made that way, and it works out just fine. Incomplete therapy is when the client withdraws, so obviously it's not ending on our terms, it's maybe ending on their terms, but not in a good way. The client has changed therapists. Sometimes we're not a good match. They might have a need that we aren't skilled to address or whatever, and the client changes the therapist. Sometimes, unfortunately, your client will engage in inpatient therapy, meaning that they will be hospitalized for whatever reason. Either they decompensate to the point that they aren't able to function in society and make outpatient appointments. Maybe they've threatened to harm themselves. Maybe they have harmed themselves. Whatever it is, they've gone into inpatient setting. Another example of incomplete therapy is if they enter substance abuse counseling, meaning that they go into a more restrictive environment. Maybe it's an intensive outpatient program to where they're getting counseling and substance abuse and support groups and psychoeducation all at one time, and they may not need your services at that moment. So what that usually means is that once they're done with that inpatient therapy or the substance abuse counseling in those two examples, they will come back to you afterwards. So they will go to a least restrictive environment. That means they'll go from this restrictive inpatient environment and then they'll go to you. Um, we can also have therapists who end therapy early. So if a therapist retires, if there's a license that revoked, or if the therapist has a hospitalization of some kind, that can end therapy. If a therapist dies, or if the client dies, that can be another example of incomplete therapy. Those happen more frequently than you would think, especially with clients dying. Sometimes clients come to see you because they have health issues, and they may die during the course of therapy. That's happened to me several times, where my client has come in, they've had cancers and things like that, or they've had just ongoing health issues that have complicated a routine sickness and have died from it. So those kinds of incomplete therapies are bound to happen reasonably frequently. So how do we know when it's time to end therapy? There are lots of answers to this, and sometimes it's based on initially a feeling that there's as much progress that has been made, but that has to come from a conversation with the client as well. But generally, if we've set up a treatment plan and the client goals have been met, that means that you're done with therapy. If they have achieved the goals that you have agreed to set out to achieve, then they're done with therapy. Simple as that. Another reason why therapy might be terminated appropriately is if there is some kind of legal obligation that has been met. So, if somebody was sent to you by the court because they came to a domestic violence group, maybe they were mandated to a DBT group, whatever it is, they have met that obligation to the court and they might stop then. Even if it's more appropriate for them to stay and to continue to get services, they may be being paid for by the court, or the court might not want them in treatment for a certain reason, or maybe they're going to elevate them or whatever. But whatever the court order is, and once they've fulfilled it, they are under no obligation to be in therapy, even if it would be appropriate for them to be there. You just essentially plan on ending therapy at the end of that order, and if they want to continue, great. If not, then you still plan to end it at that time. There's nothing worse than thinking that you have many more sessions and they come in and said, well, I'm done with my court order, so I'll see you never. That happens frequently enough, even with people who decide they want to stay, let alone people who never plan to stay in the first place. You'd be surprised how many people will say that they're going to continue in therapy and then just not come back anyways. So another reason why is that why termination is important is because when we have acute stress or trauma, the client returns to prior functioning, meaning that if somebody had some kind of awful thing happen, like a car accident, for example, that can cause a lot of anxiety. It can cause acute stress. It can cause an adjustment disorder. It could lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. Whatever those are, once the person gets back to prior functioning, so maybe it's been 3 or 4 months since the car accident, they're feeling better, they're no longer afraid to get in the car and things like that, and they're functioning as they were beforehand, then it's time to stop treatment. You don't have to keep going indefinitely just because they're not in tip-top shape. Once they've returned to prior functioning, then they can be sent on their way. And the last that we'll talk about is that external forces have been eliminated and processed. I like to use an example of a child who grew up in an abusive home. If this child has grown up in an abusive home, become an adult, and they find that they haven't adjusted well, they come to see you for therapy, and they're no longer in the home, and they've processed the feelings from before, then they can be sent on their way. The idea is that if they were being sent back into that home environment where it was stressful and abusive, then it would take more than just to work through the feelings, because then they also have to learn the coping skills and everything, and the external forces would not have been eliminated. So only when we have those external forces, so an abusive home, and we process the feelings associated with it, only then can we terminate therapy successfully. Something that people often don't think about, maybe because they don't want to think about it, is that terminating a therapeutic relationship can be painful. If you've done good work, you've established a really good relationship with somebody. And just because you are a therapist and they are a client does not mean that there is this mutual understanding and acceptance of the end of the relationship. You will get to know somebody, and that relationship will be intimate, meaning that it will be close, not, don't confuse intimacy with romance. It'll be close because you get to know somebody, and it's personal. You know a lot about them. So they've kind of opened up to you and developed a relationship. So what that means is that you have to take care to address the end of the relationship many times as you get toward that, because generally people really won't want to address it because it's painful to end a relationship. So in a lot of cases, you will have provided the best relationship that person has ever had. It sounds sad, but that's the reality, is that you'll have demonstrated a healthy, good, decent, worthwhile relationship, and they've never had that before. So it's important that you keep that in mind, that you might be not, quote unquote, you'll be letting them down, but it's obviously appropriate because you're not supposed to just hold on to this person forever. Both of you will mourn the relationship. So the ending of the relationship. So when it's over, you'll be sad about it. And you need to talk about that with your clients before the end of therapy. Well in advance, by the way. I usually spend the last 6 sessions or so focusing only on the end of the relationship because it's hard to detach in that way. It's not an unhealthy thing to be closer to like or to enjoy your clients. And it's not even inappropriate for you to be sad and to express that you're sad that the relationship is ending. That's how healthy relationships work. If you just said one day, "Oh, well, it looks like we're done here. We've had a good time and good luck," that's not a healthy end to a relationship. That's just cutting it off. So it's important that you at least do a good job of role modeling proper relationship skills by talking about the end of therapy and what it means to you, how sad you're going to be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that keeps us from talking about it is that it is difficult to admit that there is an end, and we don't want to admit it. We don't want to talk about it. We tend to be a death-denying society anyways, so we want to be sure to address that as much as we can. That way we have proper closure in the therapeutic relationship. Once we have completed the therapeutic relationship, it is a reasonable task to follow up. This is especially important for folks who were working with a clinician who was in the community mental health system or in the criminal justice or juvenile justice system. We want to know how effective our services were, and we can't know that until we look and see how long these impacts have lasted. We follow up also because it really is a personal responsibility to follow up to make sure that people are still doing okay. You don't have to call them every day, but call them maybe after the first month and after 6 months just to check and see how things are going. Generally, things are going to be just fine if you haven't heard from them. If things aren't fine, they will have called you by then. So sometimes hearing nothing is okay. Sometimes hearing nothing is not okay. It just depends on the person. So make sure that if you want to keep track and you want to know how people are doing because you want to see how effective you are, then you can call back periodically. And I'd give up after a year, even if you've been hearing from them, because after a year, they're kind of developing new routines and everything anyways. When you are following up, you will do it depending on where you work. So when you go and work somewhere, they will have different ways of following up. When you are following up, it's also important to consider something called referral and recycling. So if somebody is going to come back to you, you need to leave the door open and let them know that it's okay to come back and that they can expect that if they have issues that they can call you. And then there's a referral process. So when you refer somebody, it'll depend on where you work and what agency you work for, what the process is like. But if you aren't able to help somebody with your skill set, then you can refer them on to somebody else who can. So that recycling, where they come back to you if they need to, and referral process, where you send them off to somebody else with a different skill set, those are two important parts of the termination process that lets somebody know that they are still going to be cared for if they need help or if they find themselves wanting to come back for therapy, even if they want just a checkup or something. So that was just a brief foray into termination. There is a lot that can go into termination that we're not going to really focus on for the sake of time in the course. Feel free to read the chapter more thoroughly if you would like to. There's other ways that you can read about that. There are other really good books. Gerald Corey has a series of books. One of them is about the counseling process and talks about termination in a few different chapters. So those are available to you if you want to spend lots of money on them. Otherwise, you will do a lot of your training will focus on how do you terminate. So you'll get on-the-job training, or when you go through a master's program, you'll focus on that usually during practica and internships. So that is it for termination. And next time we'll move on to assessment.